Welcome to Session 4. This session addresses a wide range of specific information, requirements, and policies concerning our clinical teaching semester at A&M. We will go back and forth between the handbook and miscellaneous handouts, so have all of your hard copies assembled and in the correct order. For this first slide, you will need Handbook page 7, which is entitled Clinical Teaching Policies. Looking at your copy of page 7 from the handbook, you see that the second item on the page is about attendance, which is an extremely important topic for clinical teachers. Tell them that it is their responsibility to be in school each day. Let them know, though, that illnesses do sometimes occur that prevent one from attending school. One of those illnesses is fever. Another one is stomach disorder. So stay home. Go to the doctor if they feel it's appropriate. But if they just feel tired or in general do not feel well, go to school. That's what teachers do. People are depending on you. Stress that leaving the school campus during the school day is not permitted without prior approval. Tell the clinical teachers that if they are to be absent, there are 3 notifications to make. The clinical teacher, the university supervisor, that's you, and the school office. Do this as soon as possible. Inform them that all absences must be officially reported through the online student data portal and be made up. Unexcused excessive absences may result in an unsatisfactory grade in clinical teaching. Absences to substitute teach or take certification exams are unexcused. 1 excused absence is allowed for a professional interview. The makeup requirements are listed on this page. Basically, an unexcused absence is 1 makeup for 1 absence, 1 for 1. An unexcused absence is 2 makeup days per absence, 2 for 1. 3 unexcused days of absence may equal an unsatisfactory grade in clinical teaching. This is a good time to also stress the importance of being on time each day, which means being in the classroom at least 10 to 15 minutes before students arrive in the classroom. Also stress the importance of following the school's guidelines for teachers leaving school at the end of the day. On the next slide, you see the remainder of the page on clinical teaching policies. On your hard copy, look at the last section entitled Work, Courses, and Grading. Tell your students that clinical teaching is a full-time job, but we are aware that some of them must work, and work must be limited, though, to 10 to 12 hours per week and preferably be on weekends. Weekday afternoons should be free for seminars, faculty meetings, and curriculum planning. Tell them that at the end of the semester there is no letter grade assigned. Clinical teachers are assigned S for satisfactory or U for unsatisfactory. Advancing to the next slide, you will now want the page entitled Clinical Teaching Assignments in front of you. This is page 8 from the handbook. The first item in the list refers to the acknowledgement page that is in the handbook on page 4. Clinical teachers are to sign and give this page to you acknowledging that they have read the clinical teaching handbook, the information on the need for liability, insurance, etc. At the orientation seminar, you are to collect a signed copy and keep these until the semester is ended, at which time you may dispose of them. Also at the orientation seminar, tell clinical teachers that they are to upload this page into the CEHD data portal that day if they've not already done so. The third item in the list refers to the clinical teaching emergency contact form that is on page 28 in the handbook. Clinical teachers are to complete this, make copies, and submit them to you, their university supervisor, their cooperating teacher, and the campus administrator or front office. Also, they are to upload the completed form in the CEHD data portal. Find the 6th bulleted item in this list. It says, organize a clinical teaching notebook using a large 3-ringed binder with individual dividers. At your orientation seminar, make it clear to your clinical teachers that if they've not already done so, it's time to organize this notebook according to these guidelines and keep it on their desk or designated space in their classrooms. Let them know that you will need access to it each time that you observe. Tell them that you will spot check the lesson plans filed in this notebook and inspect the attendance log on each visit. The most recent lesson plan should be kept at the front of the section for lesson plans, and stress to your clinical teachers that the attendance log is their daily responsibility, not the cooperating teacher's. Point out the list of sections that will be included in the notebook, beginning with the attendance log and ending with the clinical teaching handbook. This page on clinical teaching assignments continues on to the next slide, but you stay on the same hard copy page. At the top of this slide, you see the section entitled Journal. On the hard copy page, this section entitled Journal is about halfway down the page. At the orientation seminar, discuss the importance of journaling as explained in this bullet. It's fine to make journaling a requirement. My clinical teachers begin their journaling with week 2. They generate one journal entry for each day. The journal entry can be about a specific lesson, a particular student, no name included, the day in general, a classroom management goal or issue, a successful or humorous event from that day, a problem or a concern, etc. The list goes on and on. Once the first full responsibility begins, they have the new option of replacing the daily journal entry with a weekly list of short-term goals. This weekly list of short-term goals must be recorded in the journaling spiral or clinical teaching notebook at the beginning of each week. If this option of weekly goals is chosen, one journal entry must be written at the end of the week reflecting on that week's goals. In summary, this option consists of one list of short-term goals and one journal entry per week. Many clinical teachers find this option quite helpful. I read each journal entry and initial it so my clinical teachers know I've read it. Journaling forces the clinical teacher to think about what is happening in the classroom, and reading these journal entries helps me get to know each clinical teacher in an individual manner. I really learn a lot by reading these journal entries. The next major topic on this page is entitled eCampus. All of our clinical teachers are required to go online during the semester and respond to several discussion questions and read discussion entries from other clinical teachers. This is their eCampus online requirement for this semester. You, as the university supervisor, do not have any responsibilities with this requirement other than reminding the clinical teachers to do it. Clinical teachers will receive information about eCampus as well as other official clinical teaching updates through their TAMU accounts. So remind your clinical teachers to check their A&M, TAMU accounts regularly for information from the Office of Field Experiences. If one of your clinical teachers does not meet a deadline for an eCampus assignment, you will receive an email asking you to contact that clinical teacher and remind him or her to complete the assignment that is missing. The next slide is the formal observation. Find this form on page 16 in the handbook. Our formal observation form has been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System referred to as T-TEST. You will use this form for critiquing your formal observations. You already know that you will formally observe each clinical teacher a total of 4 times during this semester, 2 times prior to the midpoint conference and at least 2 times between the midpoint conference and the final conference. Additional observations may be needed if a clinical teacher is experiencing difficulties. You also know that a pre-conference is conducted prior to each formal observation and that each observation is at least 45 minutes in length. Now let's take a look at the heading on the form. For each of your formal observations, you will need to record the date for the pre-conference, the date and time in and time out for the observation, as well as the beginning and ending time of the follow-up conference. Also take note of the rating scale for each descriptor as well as the overall rating number for each lesson observed. Prior to each observation, it is suggested that you print hard copies of this form. While observing, you will record your feedback on this form. By using carbon paper, you will have a copy to leave with the clinical teacher. And yes, I know this is really high tech, but it is quick and it does work. Using your written feedback from each formal observation, you will conduct a follow-up conference with the clinical teacher. The conference might be face-to-face immediately following the lesson or by phone at a later time that's more convenient for both of you. If it is a face-to-face conference, give the clinical teacher a hard copy of the completed observation form at the end of the conference. If the follow-up conference will be later by phone, then leave a hard copy of the completed observation form on the clinical teacher's desk before you leave. Focus on self-evaluation during each follow-up conference. Have the clinical teacher reflect on what went well and what did not. Use the feedback from the clinical teacher as a springboard to guide this follow-up conference. Remember to note the beginning time and ending time for each follow-up conference. You will need this information later when filling out the online form. After the follow-up conference, you will use the link provided to you by the Office of Field Experiences to enter your data from the observation to the online formal observation form. This needs to be done within 48 hours of the observation. Once you click submit, your typed data will automatically be emailed to the clinical teacher. It is now the clinical teacher's responsibility to type and submit reflections about this lesson. You can see the reflection questions at the bottom of the observation form. The clinical teacher is to complete each reflection within 48 hours of receiving the automated typed document. Once the clinical teacher hits submit, an electronic copy of the information you entered online, including the clinical teacher's reflections, will automatically be sent to the cooperating teacher, the building principal, A&M, etc. No action is required by the recipients of this final electronic copy. It is simply an attempt by TEA to keep everyone informed of how the clinical teacher is progressing. Just so you know, you and the clinical teacher will also receive an electronic copy of this final documentation. The next slide is the midpoint final evaluation form. Find this form on page 17 in the handbook. This midpoint final evaluation will be used to document each clinical teacher's progress and will guide the midpoint conference, which is conducted during weeks 6 or 7. This same form will be used again at the final conference during weeks 13 or 14. This form has also been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System, known as T-TEST. Notice the rating scale that will be used for each descriptor. Also take note of the 4 domains: planning, instruction, learning environment, and professional practices and responsibilities. You will give prior notification through an email to the cooperating teacher noting a day and time for the 3-way midpoint conference, and do the same later in the semester for the final conference. You and the cooperating teacher will each fill out this form separately and bring the completed forms to the midpoint conference and again to the final conference at the end of the semester. At the midpoint and again at the final conference, you will meet with the cooperating teacher first for approximately 10 minutes to compare numbers on your completed evaluation forms. The numbers may or may not be the same. As long as the numbers are consecutive, all is well. In other words, a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4 would be fine. If the numbers are a 2 and a 4, then discuss the reason for the wide gap and make the needed changes. Following this brief meeting with the cooperating teacher, have the clinical teacher join you and the cooperating teacher. Conduct a 15 to 20 minute 3-way conference. As noted earlier, this midpoint final evaluation provides structure for the conference. At the midpoint, the 3-way conference is focused on the clinical teacher's strengths and areas for growth or refinement as indicated on the evaluation form. At the final conference, keep the focus on the areas where the clinical teacher has grown, as indicated by the numbers on the evaluation form. Mention the areas that will continue to improve with experience. It is also a good time to address interviewing tips. Give the cooperating teacher ample time and opportunity for input during both the midpoint and final conferences. At the midpoint conference and again at the final conference, the clinical teacher will receive a hard copy of the evaluation form from you and one from the cooperating teacher. Once the midpoint conference is complete, and again later when the final conference is complete, you and the cooperating teacher each go online using the links provided by the Office of Field Experiences and enter the numbers you each have on your form. To repeat, the university supervisor and cooperating teachers do separately enter their numbers online after the midpoint conference and again after the final conference. After the final conference, the university supervisor and cooperating teachers do one more thing. A recommendation for standard certification must be submitted in the CEHD data portal. After the final conference, there is another important item left for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. Remind each cooperating teacher to go online to evaluate you, the university supervisor, and remind each clinical teacher to evaluate his or her university supervisor and cooperating teacher. The Office of Field Experiences will send the proper links to the cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. You could also forward those links to cooperating teachers and clinical teachers at that time. The next slide is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint, and Final Conferences. Find your copy of this miscellaneous handout. Again, it is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint, and Final Conferences. The basics of what you need to remember about observations, including TEA requirements, and midpoint and final conferences are all summarized on this one page. For this reason, I refer to it as your go-to page on documentation requirements for observations and or midpoint final conferences. With a few exceptions, everything on this page has already been mentioned during this audio session. So we will go to the next slide at this time. For this slide, you will need your copy of page 26 from the handbook. It is entitled Growth Probation Plan. If a clinical teacher is experiencing significant problems, the university supervisor will observe this clinical teacher more often than the minimum number of observations. If these significant problems occur over and over with no improvement noted, it may be time for a growth plan. If a problem is caught early enough, a growth plan will generally solve the issue or problem. Your access to the online growth plan is through a link which is on the very same page where you gain access to the online formal observation form. Record your documentation for the growth plan on this online form. But please note that it is a good idea, in fact you should notify Kim Parrish before submitting it online. Be specific with the problematic areas, suggest intervention strategies, a timeline, and any other pertinent information. For the rare occasions when a growth plan does not successfully solve the issues, confer with Kim Parrish in the Office of Field Experiences to receive guidance before proceeding with a probation plan. Just so you know, situations requiring a probation plan are rare. For the next slide, you want your copy of page 27 from the handbook. It is the clinical teacher's attendance log. You will explain this page in detail to your clinical teachers. Note the first column is labeled a numbered day. Clinical teachers will enter a number 1 by their start date and continue with numbers 2 through 70 for each full field day in their assigned classroom. Clinical teachers will enter their arrival and departure times for each day of clinical teaching. The day for career fair will not need an arrival or departure time. Holidays will need to be labeled appropriately with no numbered day or times. Staff development days do count toward the 70 days, so we'll need all data recorded on those. It is the clinical teacher's responsibility to keep the log up to date and ask his or her cooperating teacher to initial the data each day. The clinical teacher's initial will indicate that the data entered is correct. You, the university supervisor, will monitor this requirement by spot checking and initialing the log on the date of each observation. I do stress that you will initial the log on each of the 4 observation dates. Be sure to sign the attendance logs during the final conferences. Remind clinical teachers that they must upload a signed copy into the CEHD data portal at the end of the semester. The next slide is the emergency contact form. This is a required form. It is if an emergency occurs during the clinical teacher's field experience, this form would be vitally important. Tell the clinical teachers to fill out the required information. Tell them to make 3 copies to distribute, 1 for you, their cooperating teacher, and the front office. They are to distribute this form on or by the first day of clinical teaching. Also remind them to upload this completed form into the CEHD data portal for use by the Field Experiences office. Pardon my allergies. For the next slide and the following 3 slides, you will need your copy of the miscellaneous handout entitled Supervisor's Weekly Plan of Action. This handout is 4 pages in length. This is a week-by-week guide as to what a Texas A&M University supervisor does during the semester. Use it as a reference. Since I'm a university supervisor, I have included items in this document that reflect what I personally do in addition to what is required. Make adjustments as you go that will fit your style of supervision. Just make sure that you are fulfilling all of the basic requirements. Since this document is quite detailed and an easy read, we will not spend time discussing every single detail. We will, however, quickly skim through each main heading so that you will have an idea of the type of information that is included here. Week 1 includes miscellaneous information about the orientation seminar for clinical teachers, along with suggestions of what to discuss or emphasize during the seminar. Remember, you're setting the tone for this semester. Be specific with your expectations, the deadlines, the requirements and responsibilities, etc. Some of these have been listed below. Point out that the state of Texas requires 70 days in the classroom in order to be certified to teach, and A&M requires an additional day for the career fair, so the total equals 71 required days. All days of absence must be made up. These days are made up after the last official day of clinical teaching. Tell your clinical teachers to pay special attention to the attendance information on page 7 of the handbook, and specifics are included here. Inform clinical teachers that a daily attendance log must be maintained, and remember to stress that this is their responsibility, not the cooperating teachers. It is also their responsibility to get their cooperating teacher to initial it on a daily basis. In order to qualify for graduation, an accurate attendance log must be submitted online at the end of the semester. Discuss how absences are reported. Explain that in addition to notifying the cooperating teacher, you, and the school office about an absence, that clinical teachers are to officially record each day of absence online using the student data portal provided by the Office of Field Experiences. In addition, the makeup day for each absence must be recorded in the portal. Set a positive professional tone for the semester, and specifics are included here. Now back to the bullets. Note that the high visit is optional but highly recommended, and why. There's information about the second seminar, which is mandatory. Note that weekly updates are optional, but it is wise to send them. It is equally wise to send updates and reminders, etc., to your cooperating teachers on an as-needed basis. There's information about weekly schedules, such as when they are due, and options on how they are to be submitted to you. Moving on to the next slide. Now weeks 2 through 4. There is a suggestion concerning when to begin observing, which is to wait until week 3. There's information about what to observe for the first formal observation, and the observation form to use, which is the formal observation form. There's also information about the length of each observation, which is at least 45 minutes. Also, what to do before and after each observation. You already know to conduct a pre-observation conference. The method is your choice, in person, by phone, or electronically. A follow-up conference is also required for each observation. The follow-up conferences can be face-to-face or by phone, but not electronically like the pre-conference. Self-evaluation is emphasized. Also provide the clinical teacher with a copy of your written documentation. There is information about the online requirement. You are to transfer your handwritten feedback to the online version of the formal observation form, and details about this are listed in this bullet. There is a bullet about the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Remind your cooperating teachers that clinical teachers need regular written feedback. You will need to emphasize that each clinical teacher should receive some type of written feedback at least once a week from his or her cooperating teacher. By the end of week 4, each cooperating teacher should have one complete formal observation by you, his or her university supervisor. The last bullet addresses the growth probation plan, which we have already discussed. Moving on to the next slide. Weeks 5 and 6. The second formal observation is discussed. The last bullet is about thinking ahead to week 7, which is generally midpoint conference week. You will want to ask your clinical teachers to acquire information from their cooperating teachers about conflicts that might occur during conference periods for week 7 and ask them to record these conflicts on their week 7 schedules. Now, week 7, there is a reminder about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the midpoint conferences and a discussion about preparing for the midpoint conference. The format for the midpoint conference is discussed. This is a good review of details that were discussed earlier in this audio session. The online requirement for you and the cooperating teacher is also discussed again. It may be necessary to remind the cooperating teacher to complete this requirement within 48 hours of the conference. Once these forms are submitted, they are automatically sent to the clinical teacher, who records his or her reflections on each form. When the clinical teacher clicks submit, the completed midpoint final evaluations are automatically sent to the clinical teacher, his or her cooperating teacher, the principal, A&M, etc. No further action is required. Now for the last slide in this audio session, weeks 8 through 10. There's information here about the third formal observation. Also, there's information about second environment, which is optional. Second environment is simply observing in other classrooms for no more than 5 days. Weeks 11 through 13, there's information here about the fourth formal observation. Also, there is a reminder about thinking ahead to week 14, as well as information about a wrap-up seminar, which is optional. Week 14 may extend into week 15 in order to total 70 days plus career fair. There's information here about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the final conferences, also the guidelines for the final conference. Remember that after the final conference, the university supervisor and cooperating teacher will each submit an electronic copy of the final evaluation in the CEHD data portal within 48 hours of the final conference. Also, using that same portal, the supervisor and cooperating teacher will each submit a recommendation for standard certification, and then there's information about the important last step for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. Remember that this document is an excellent week-by-week reference or resource for you on the basic requirements. I hope that each of you will take time to read through this entire document and refer to it during this semester as needed. You're welcome to email me with questions. My contact information is at the end of the document. This concludes Session 4.